The day was cold but bright in the small town of Maplewood. The streets were quiet, covered with a thin layer of snow that crackled under the shoes of the few people walking by. A little bakery stood at the corner of the main street. Its windows were warm and foggy from the smell of fresh bread and cookies that came out from the oven. Inside the bakery, a small boy named Ethan pushed open the door. His jacket was too big for him, and his shoes looked a bit worn. He carried a few crumpled dollar bills in his small hand and looked carefully at the shelves. Ethan stood in front of a glass case filled with cookies of all kinds. Some were shaped like stars, some had chocolate chips, and some were covered with colored sugar. His eyes stopped at a small box with a red ribbon tied around it. He could almost hear his mother's voice in his mind saying how nice those cookies looked. She had been working long hours at the diner, and she often said she missed baking like she used to. Ethan wanted to bring her those cookies and make her smile again. He counted the money in his hand quietly. It had $1, $2, $3 and some coins. He looked up at the price tag on the shelf. It showed $4.50. His heart sank. He turned his pockets inside out, hoping to find one more coin, but there was nothing left. The cashier, a friendly young woman, walked over to help him. She smiled and asked if he needed something. Ethan nodded shyly and asked how much the small box of cookies cost. When she told him the price, his face fell. She noticed and spoke kindly to him, asking if everything was all right. Ethan hesitated and said softly that he did not have enough money. Then he quickly put the box back on the shelf and said he would come back another time to buy it. At that moment, a tall man standing near the coffee counter had been watching the scene. His name was Lucas Grant. He wore a dark coat, a scarf, and carried himself with quiet confidence. Most people in Maplewood knew his name. He was the man who owned 2 hotels and several companies across the state. They called him the Quiet Millionaire because he rarely spoke to anyone except in business meetings. He had built a life full of money, but his days had lost all warmth. He drank his coffee alone every morning and drove home to an empty house at night. When Lucas saw the boy speaking to the cashier, something inside him changed a little. He watched how the boy's small hand carefully placed the box back on the shelf, how his eyes lingered for a moment longer before he turned to leave. Lucas could tell that the boy wanted to buy it for someone else, not himself. It reminded him of the time when he was young and his own mother had smiled at him over a plate of cookies they could barely afford. He felt an ache deep in his chest, one that he had not felt in years. Lucas left his half-finished coffee and followed the boy outside. The snow was falling gently now, covering the sidewalk with a soft white layer. Ethan was walking slowly, his head down and hands deep in his pockets. Lucas called out to him and asked if those were the cookies he wanted to buy. Ethan nodded, a little startled to be spoken to by a stranger. Lucas asked how much he was short. The boy told him quietly, and added that it was all right, that he was going to save up and come back in a few days. Lucas smiled and offered to buy the cookies for him right away. Ethan shook his head almost instantly, said that his mother always told him never to take what he could not earn. There was strength and pride in his voice, even though he looked small under the falling snow. Lucas looked at him in silence for a short moment. Then he said softly that sometimes kindness was not a gift, but a way of sharing what one had been given. Still, the boy refused politely. Lucas respected that and did not insist further, but he could not let the matter go either. He turned back into the bakery, quietly paid for the cookies, and came out again holding the box wrapped in red ribbon. Ethan blinked in surprise as Lucas handed him the box. The man said the cookies were a gift for his mother, not from a stranger, but from someone who understood what it meant to care for her. Ethan stared at the box for a moment and then finally smiled, a shy but bright smile that lit his face. He thanked Lucas and ran down the street toward his small apartment building while Lucas stood there watching the boy disappear around the corner. A cold wind blew, but Lucas did not feel it much. His eyes were thoughtful. He did not know why this small thing had touched him so deeply, but it felt like the beginning of something he had been missing for a long time. When he turned to leave, the snow was falling harder, and the lights in the bakery windows looked warmer than before. Lucas drove away from the bakery, but his thoughts stayed behind with the boy. The lights of Maplewood flickered across his windshield, but he barely noticed. Ethan's voice kept echoing in his mind, the way he had refused help with so much quiet pride. It reminded him of another voice from long ago, his mother's voice. She had been a strong woman who taught him about honesty and hard work when they had nothing. He could still remember her hands dusted with flour as she baked bread in a tiny kitchen, smiling through the hardest days. Those memories had grown faint under years of business meetings, house deals, and empty dinners, but now they returned like a warm breeze from a forgotten season. When Lucas reached his big house on Pine Lane, he parked the car and sat quietly for a while before going inside. The living room was large and well decorated, but it felt cold and silent. There were paintings on the walls, but none of them showed a person he knew. He removed his coat, sat down on the couch, and stared at the city lights through the glass window. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of loneliness pressing against his chest. Money had filled his hands, but not his heart. The picture of that little boy walking through the falling snow would not leave his mind. The next morning, Lucas woke up earlier than usual. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and looked at his schedule. There were meetings lined up till noon, but for some reason he felt restless. He kept thinking about the boy's mother and wondered how she might have reacted when her child came home with the box of cookies, left for work but took a longer route that passed by the apartment area where Ethan lived. The building looked old and worn, with peeling paint and broken mailboxes. Still, there were flowers growing on one of the windowsills. He guessed that must be their apartment. Later that day, after finishing his business appointments, Lucas found himself walking back into the same little bakery. The smell of sugar and butter welcomed him. The same cashier recognized him and smiled politely. He asked her if she knew the boy who had been there the day before and bought the cookies. The woman nodded and said that everyone in the neighborhood knew Ethan and his mother. She told him their story in bits and pieces between helping customers. Clara, the boy's mother, worked late shifts at the diner. She had once dreamed of opening her own bakery many years ago, but life had not been kind. Her husband had fallen ill, and every bit of her savings went to hospital bills. After he passed away, she worked any job she could find while raising her son alone. Lucas listened quietly, his hands resting in his coat pockets. He felt a mixture of admiration and sadness. The cashier told him that Clara still came to the bakery sometimes, not to buy much but to look at the pastries as if she was remembering something from the past. Before leaving, Lucas thanked the woman for the information and stepped outside into the cold air again. The thought of Clara, still trying to provide for her boy and smiling through it all, settled deep in his mind. That evening, he decided to visit their apartment. He carried a small paper bag from the bakery, containing some fresh bread and cookies. As he climbed the narrow stairway, he heard soft laughter from behind one of the doors. He knocked gently. Ethan opened the door, surprised to see him again. The boy called for his mother, and soon Clara appeared, wiping her hands on a towel. Her face looked tired, but kind. She had brown hair tied back and eyes that seemed both strong and gentle. When she saw the rich man standing in her doorway with a bakery bag, she looked confused but polite. Lucas introduced himself and said he wanted to return the bakery box that Ethan had left behind in his rush. It was a small excuse, but it helped him start talking. Clara invited him inside, though she seemed unsure. The living room was small but tidy. The curtains were old, but sunlight made the space glow softly. Ethan sat quietly, eyeing Lucas with shy curiosity. Acta thanked him for his kindness and apologized if her son had troubled him in any way. Lucas shook his head and said that her son had done nothing wrong. He spoke with calm respect and mentioned that Ethan had reminded him of himself at that age. As they talked, Lucas noticed the smell of homemade soup coming from the kitchen. It was simple food, but it filled the room with warmth. Clara asked if he wanted to stay for dinner. And though Lucas usually would have refused such offers, he agreed without thinking twice. The meal was modest, yet it was the most comforting one he had shared in years. He listened as Clara talked about her life, her work at the diner, and her dreams that she still kept in her heart, though they seemed so far away. Ethan showed him a small school project, and Lucas praised it honestly. Laughter came softly to the table, blending with the smell of soup and bread. When it was time to leave, Lucas thanked them both and said he hoped to see them again. Clara smiled, her face bright and warm despite fatigue. As he walked down the street, the air felt lighter. The cold did not bite as sharply as before. Something new had begun to stir in his chest, something he had almost forgotten he could feel. The next few days passed slowly for Lucas. His business meetings continued as usual. His phone kept ringing, and his secretary brought him thick files to sign. But none of it gave him the same interest it once did. Every time he tried to focus on numbers or reports, his mind wandered to that small apartment. The smell of the soup and the sound of Clara's calm voice. He had not met a person like her in years. Her eyes carried kindness and courage, and her voice carried something steady, something that reminded him of simpler days. What surprised him most was how lightly she carried her struggles, never asking for pity or help. Late one afternoon, Lucas left his office earlier than normal. He drove again to Maplewood, taking the same street that led to the diner where Clara worked. Through the window, he could see her moving quickly between tables, smiling at customers and carrying plates. She looked tired, but still pleasant. For a long moment, he just watched, not wanting to disturb her. Something inside him wanted to give her more than small kindness. He wanted to return the chance at life that hardship had stolen from her. When Clara finally finished her shift, she walked out with a small coat pulled tight around her shoulders. The winter air was heavy. Lucas approached her carefully, afraid she might think him strange for following her there. But when she saw him, she smiled softly and said she was glad to see him again. Ethan had talked about him all week, she added. Lucas laughed quietly and said that her son was a fine boy who reminded him how honest and strong a young heart could be. They walked together down the street. Clara mentioned that times were still hard. The rent kept rising and the diner had fewer customers these days. But she quickly added that she was grateful to have a job and that she believed better days would come. Lucas listened closely. When she spoke, he could feel every word touched by faith and dignity. He could see that she had not lost hope even after all she had endured. He asked her, almost carefully, about her dreams. For a moment she looked surprised, as if she had not been asked that in a long time. Then she said she once dreamed of owning a small bakery. She had learned baking from her grandmother and used to sell muffins and cookies at the local farmers market before life got complicated. She smiled faintly and said that now it was only a distant wish. Lucas nodded and said nothing more for the moment, but an idea had already begun to form in his mind. That night, Lucas walked into his study and sat by the wide window. Outside, the moon was hanging low, and the lights of the town gleamed faintly. He began to sketch a plan on a piece of paper. If he bought a small place near Main Street, renovated it, and set up basic baking equipment, it could work. But he did not want to do this as charity. He wanted to make it a fair and true partnership. He wanted Clara to take charge, to build the bakery with her own hands, her own name. He wanted to give her the chance, not the favor. The next morning, Lucas met an old friend named Henry, who managed real estate in Maplewood. He asked him to find a small, warm spot on Main Street where a bakery could open, not too large but cozy and bright. Henry laughed and said this was an odd request from a man known for making hotel chains and office towers. But Lucas only smiled and said this time it was something more personal. By the end of the week, a small shop space became available near the florist and bookstore. Lucas went to see it himself. The floor needed polishing, the counter was old, and the walls had faded paint. But he could already imagine it filled with the smell of brown sugar and cinnamon, with warm light and people smiling. He closed his eyes for a moment and could see Clara behind the counter, handing cookies to a customer with that calm smile of hers. The next day, Lucas visited Clara at her apartment once again. She welcomed him inside and poured him tea. Ethan looked happy to see him and kept asking questions about his car and his work. After a while, Lucas turned to Clara and said he wanted to talk about something important. He spoke simply, saying that he had found a shop that could become a bakery and that he wanted to invest in her dream. Clara looked confused and then shocked. She told him she could not accept charity. Lucas assured her it was not charity but a real business proposal. She would be the owner and manager. He would only help her start it and share profit until she could buy him out whenever she wished. Clara was silent for a long time. Then she said she was afraid. She said dreams could break your heart if you were not ready. Lucas replied gently that sometimes dreams could also heal the heart if you dared to try. He told her she had already built a life out of strength. She only had to shape it with hope. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled through them, nodding slowly. When Lucas left that night, the snow was falling again. City lights shimmered in the white air. His heart felt lighter than it had in years because this time his work no longer felt empty. It felt like something good and real was beginning to take root. The months that followed were busy and full of new energy. The small shop on Main Street slowly began to change. The old walls were repainted, a warm cream color, the floors were fixed, and the smell of fresh paint mixed with the scent of new hope. Clara came every day after her shift to see the progress. She often brought Ethan along, who would sweep the dust off the floor and ask 100 questions about ovens and baking displays. The workers liked him because he always smiled and never got in the way. Lucas stopped by often to check the work, but mostly just to watch Clara's face light up each time a new piece was finished. When the oven finally arrived, Clara stood in front of it, as if in awe. She ran her hand across the shiny metal and whispered something that sounded like thank you. Lucas heard it and smiled quietly, told her it was all hers now, to make it what she dreamed of. He noticed how natural she looked in that space, as if she belonged there. She started testing her old recipes after hours, staying late into the night mixing butter, sugar, and flour. Sometimes Lucas would bring coffee for both of them and sit by the counter while she baked. The smell of chocolate filled the air, and he listened to the sound of her laughter echoing softly through the empty shop. When the grand opening day came, Clara woke up before sunrise. She had baked trays of muffins, cookies, and small cakes. The sign outside read Clara's Crumbs. It was simple, but beautiful. Ethan wore a new shirt and helped by opening the door for customers. Lucas stood a little aside, letting Clara have her moment. Soon the shop began to fill with people. Some were neighbors, some curious passers-by, and a few knew her from the diner. The smell of fresh pastries drifted out onto the street. People smiled as they tasted her baking, and soon laughter filled the place. Clara moved around gracefully behind the counter. Her cheeks were red from the heat of the oven, and her eyes were bright. Look. Lucas watched her and saw something bloom in her that was far beyond gratitude. It was pride, joy, and freedom. Every time she handed a cookie to a customer, it was like giving away a small piece of hope. Ethan ran around helping, laughing, tasting cookies, and waving at his mother whenever his eyes found hers. The little bakery soon became the heart of the neighborhood, filled with warmth and sweetness. Lucas continued to visit often, sometimes for business reasons, sometimes for no reason at all. He told himself he was there to see how things were running, but each visit left him lighter, more alive. He discovered he liked helping mix dough and trying her new recipes, though he was far from skilled at it. Clara would laugh when he made a mess of flour on the counter, and he would joke about being her worst helper. Those small moments carried something special, quiet but strong. Ethan grew attached to Lucas. He started calling him his lucky charm, saying the bakery only did well when Lucas was around. Lucas's eyes softened at that. The bond between them deepened slowly and naturally, just like everything else. Lucas began to feel something he had never known before. It was not the pride of success or the weight of wealth, but the comfort of belonging. For once, he had found a place where he did not need to prove anything. One evening, after closing the shop, Clara and Lucas sat outside on a small bench. The lights from the bakery glowed through the windows, and the scent of leftover cookies filled the air. Clara thanked him again for everything he had done. Lucas told her she owed him nothing. He said she had rebuilt something greater than a business. She had rebuilt faith. She looked at him with quiet eyes and said that maybe he had done the same for himself. They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding more in that quiet than words could have said. The days turned into weeks, and the bakery continued to grow busy. Children stopped by after school for cookies, and families came on weekends for bread and coffee. Clara hired 2 helpers to keep up with the orders. Lucas made sure she had everything she needed, but never took credit for her success. The bakery belonged to her, and everyone knew it. Yet people often noticed how his presence seemed to brighten her smile. Some gentle whispers started in town about how close they had grown, but neither paid any attention. Their friendship was sincere and steady. One night, there was a sudden power cut in town while Clara was baking for a large order. She panicked at first, afraid the dough would spoil. Lucas arrived soon with lanterns and stayed to help her finish mixing the last batch. Together, they worked by the soft glow of the lanterns. Their hands moved quickly, and their laughter melted the worry away. When the lights finally came back on, Clara looked around and said this was the happiest kind of hard work she had ever done. Lucas smiled and said it was the finest thing he had ever built. In those moments of shared effort, they both began to see that what had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into something larger. It was not only a bakery but a bond, a symbol of what faith, honesty, and care could create. The shop stood as proof that one good deed has the power to change more than a life. It could change a heart. A full year passed since the day Clara's Crumbs opened its doors. The bakery was now one of the happiest places in Maplewood. The walls were lined with photographs of smiling customers, handwritten thank you notes, and a calendar filled with orders. Every morning the smell of coffee and warm pastries covered the street before the sun fully rose. Lucas often came by early, bringing fresh flowers for the counter. He would help arrange tables, while Clara prepared the day's first batch of muffins. Ethan ran through the store wishing a good morning to everyone who came in. The laughter inside the shop spilled out onto the street, making people pause and smile. For Lucas, the year had changed everything. He still managed his companies, but his mornings now began with joy instead of silence. He was no longer a man who rushed through days without meaning. The bakery had become part of his world. The friendship with Clara and the bond with Ethan had softened something deep within him. Where once there had been only empty wealth, there was now purpose. People in town no longer spoke about Lucas Grant the millionaire. They spoke about Lucas Grant who helped build Clara's bakery, who held the door open for customers, and who laughed like a man discovering youth again. Clara had grown stronger and more confident. At first she had been nervous about running the business, but with time she came to trust herself. Her hands moved easily from kneading dough to serving customers, and her smile carried the calm of someone who had found where she belonged. She often looked at Ethan and thought of how far they had come. There were still worries, but they no longer ruled her life. She worked until her arms ached, yet she smiled through it all because she loved every moment. On the morning of the bakery's first anniversary, Ethan woke up early with excitement, held a small box tied with a blue ribbon. Inside were cookies he had made himself the night before, the same kind he had once tried to buy for his mother when he could not afford them. With careful handwriting, he wrote a note that said, "Thank you for helping us believe again." He placed the box on the counter, waiting for Lucas to arrive. Clara did not know about the surprise. She only saw her son quietly pacing by the window, grinning from ear to ear. When Lucas walked in, the bell above the door jingled like a cheerful greeting. Ethan rushed toward him and handed him the small box. For a moment, Lucas did not understand. Then the memory came back with full weight. The bakery, the cookies, the boy standing in the cold street a year ago. He looked at the box, then at Ethan, whose eyes sparkled with pride. Clara watched, touched by the moment, though she did not yet know the story behind it. Lucas opened the box and saw the same kind of cookies, baked with the uneven shapes of a child's careful hands. The smell of sugar and butter filled the room, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. Lucas felt his throat tighten. He remembered that day faintly covered in snow, when a boy had refused his help out of simple honesty. That moment had been the start of everything. He looked at Clara and Ethan standing together, their faces glowing with quiet happiness. Then he spoke softly, thanking Ethan for the gift and saying that these cookies were the most precious thing anyone had ever given him. Clara looked surprised, and Lucas finally told her the story of how they had met that winter day. He told her about Ethan's refusal to take help, his courage, and how deeply it had touched him. Clara stood silently as tears filled her eyes. She said that she had raised Ethan to be brave and kind, but never imagined his honesty would bring them such luck. Lucas said it was not luck but the goodness they had carried all along that had merely found a way to bloom. They spent that whole day celebrating. The bakery was filled with friends, families, and loyal customers. There was music playing from a small speaker Ethan had borrowed. And everyone clapped when Clara brought out a large cake that said, "1 year of sweetness." Lucas helped her cut slices and hand them out. People shared stories about how the bakery had brought joy to the town. Some said they came not only for the food, but for the way it felt inside those walls, as if kindness itself was baked into the bread. As the day came to an end and the crowd left, Clara stood beside Lucas outside the shop. The streetlights glowed softly, casting reflections on the windows. Ethan was cleaning up inside, humming to himself. Clara turned to Lucas and asked in a gentle voice if he ever missed his old life, the one filled with offices and meetings. He looked at her and said quietly that he did not miss a single thing. What he had now was richer than anything money could buy. She smiled and said she felt the same. The air grew cooler as night settled in. Clara looked through the window at her son stacking chairs and whispered that she could never repay him for what he had done. Lucas shook his head and said she already had. She had given him back the feeling of home. Clara's eyes softened, and for a long moment they stood in silence, listening to the distant laughter still drifting from inside.